G'day folks, welcome back to part 2 of our conversation with Mir Imran, serial innovator and fearless entrepreneur. In this episode, we'll go a little further into his philosophy about innovation and what he believes the future holds for medtech. So you did a stint at med school. So what was the story behind that?
So, one of my professors in engineering also had an appointment at the medical school. And I had helped him on a couple of his projects. And he said, Mir, you have to go to medical school. And that was a total shock. I said, no, I don't have to and I won't. I'm an engineer. So he said, you have to do that. I said, well, why do I have to do that? He said, there's so many unsolved problems in medicine. And somebody who has knowledge of both engineering disciplines, multiple disciplines in engineering and this. And he couldn't convince me. Months go by, and then finally one day he says, let's walk down to the med school. I want to introduce you to someone. And took me to the head of surgery, Dr. McKenzie. And he, my professor, Dr. Deutsch, Sid Deutsch, told him that this is the Indian fellow I was telling you about. He can do just about anything. And so now Dr. McKenzie was a tinkerer himself and had a lot of ideas for projects, but he had nobody to do them. So, but he said, you have to get him into the medical school and give him a stipend. He is not going to do the MCATs. And I'm just stunned. This is the first time it was becoming real. I said, I don't want to do that. He said, I will talk later. So Dr. McKenzie said, okay, I'll do that. In condition, you have to help me with some of the projects in your spare time. And they gave me a lab, which was a trailer right outside of the building. There's because the building is, so in this trailer, I set up a lab for the department of surgery and did a lot of interesting projects and hated medical school.
But did you get through?
I did not go through the clinical rotation. I just did the coursework and some of the cadaver work, and I had been doing a lot of animal work as a paid job with rhesus monkeys. We had a colony of rhesus monkeys in the same building that those offices and classrooms and so on. But that exposure, the reason I hated it is because there were no clear explanations for so many things. 45 years ago, the knowledge of medicine is all rudimentary and you had to memorize everything, and every time I asked a question, they didn't have an answer. So I was just very frustrated as an engineer who dealing with deterministic things, and here you have an indeterminate environment.
But in hindsight, do you think getting that exposure?
It was the best thing that happened to me, because there was just an amazing list of problems that I kept thinking about and coming up with. And but then I met a really brilliant cardiologist from Johns Hopkins who had come to give a lecture. His name was Dr. Michel Mirowski. Mirowski, the story goes that a few years earlier, his best friend had died of sudden cardiac death. And there was nobody to, defibrillate him and bring him, resuscitate him. And so he went on a mission to create a wearable defibrillator. When he had come to give a lecture, Dr. McKenzie introduced him to me. He said, he said, I need help. He said, this guy can help you. So one of the projects I had worked on with the Department of Psychiatry was a deep brain stimulator designed for rhesus monkeys. It was the size of my thumb, hand-built, surgically implanted with depth electrodes. We must have done 30, 40 monkeys. I used to perform the surgeries. He had taught me how to do that, and electronics was kind of second nature to me. I'd done that. So when he was talking about wearable, I said, so how will they sleep with that wearable? How will they keep it on while they're taking a shower? Mm-hmm. I said, why not make it fully implanted? He said, really, you can do that? I said, of course you can do that. Now, I had no clue. I'd never thought about an implantable defibrillator. But I always saw the possibilities, right? So he said, we're going to start a company. So he said, I know some wealthy individuals. So we went around talking to wealthy individuals. And, mind you, I was 23, 24 years old by then. And we were able to raise money, and the investors were in Pittsburgh, and a company called Medrad. The CEO was a physician, Steve Heilman, really brilliant guy. And he liked the idea, and he invested. And I moved to Pittsburgh and started developing that. And Dr. Mirowski was very deeply involved. Eli Lilly, the investor, was the Medrad CEO, introduced us to Eli Lilly. They made a sizable $12 million investment, and we conducted the clinical trials. And at the end, when we got approval, they bought the company. And then that company became part of what ultimately became Guidant. Yeah. So the CRM division. So my contribution was all the scientific, technical work. I worked with Roger Winkle here. So Roger was amazing, and learned so much from him. And then after selling that, during the last stages, I met with Ray Williams, who was an amazing icon here, who really contributed hugely to the medical device industry and invested in some of the riskiest business.
John Simpson said the same thing about Ray. Tom Fogarty has said the same thing. Right. Paul Yock has said the same thing. It's remarkable.
So he said, Mir, come, and Bill Starling was at ACS, and Bill, he said, I had done the defibrillator, so it was now well known that there was a defibrillator, but our first generation device was, size of a cigarette pack, implanted in abdomen. So Ray and Bill and I decided and start a company called Ventritex. And Ray actually continued to help me. He got me involved in a couple of other investments of his. He was just such an amazing guy.
Yeah, he really does. Sounds like a special guy that had a sort of incredibly influential role to play in the development of this industry.
Absolutely, absolutely. And he was the catalyst. He always wrote the first check. So the Ventritex, the investors, that's where I met Tom Fogarty. He was one of the earliest investors, came in with Ray Williams and Jeff Hartzler, and who was another amazing cardiologist, became good friends with me. So a lot of these icons, John Simpson, a lot of people invested in Ventritex, and I got to know a lot of them.
So you've had, I'm going to jump around a little bit. So from the initial experience at Medrad through to Ventritex, now there's been 20 or 30 companies, and we mentioned it in the introduction. You've come up with a concept of what innovation is.
Mm-hmm.
You want to describe that to me? How do you define innovation?
So I'll give you a little background on that. So I was really fascinated by this whole process of innovation. How does it work? Why I'm able to create things, and what is the thought process that leads me to that? And I read a number of books. The one that I remember most vividly is a book called Higher Creativity. I mentioned that to you, and many other books. And none of the books told you how to innovate, how to invent, what is innovation.
Mm-hmm.
And they basically describe the habits of inventors. So I was frustrated, and I said, okay, I'm doing it naturally, and maybe there is a pattern. There is a pattern that I'm following unknowingly. So I became a conscious observer of everything I was doing. Every decision I was making, and how those thoughts were progressing. And it took me another 8-9 companies, and a dozen years later, in the probably early to mid 90s, I started seeing a pattern emerge.
Mm-hmm.
And that was very exciting to me. And then I started thinking, okay, how do I define innovation? What is the definition? Because I figure you can't teach anything unless you can define it.
Yep.
When you define something, you own it. So what I realized was the aha moment for me was once I identified a problem and I spent time with it and understanding it, that was the aha moment. Because I had such a rich background in engineering, in all the different disciplines of engineering. So I didn't have to think about technology.
Mm-hmm.
I only focused on the problem. And the problem actually, that deep understanding and being able to frame the problem succinctly and clearly leads you, in any case, to solutions, one or more solutions. And those are inventions. So what I settled on was identification and framing of a problem is the innovation. And that gives birth to hundreds of inventions. Sometimes, it depends on technology. So that actually worked really well for me. And then I started thinking, how do I find problems? What all these things I've done. So I made a list of how I found the problem. So
Mm-hmm.
so the worst way of finding problems is to start with the technology and say, I'm going to solve the problem with this.
Yeah.
Well, when engineers are added, they are so impressed and facile with the technology they have learned, the skill they have learned, because to them that's the center of their world, and everything they see through that lens.
So that's your definition of innovation is the actual process of deeply understanding a problem.
Correct.
Right. So I think and that's you opened my eyes a little bit when we had this conversation the other day, because I really think that's key, right? And we've got teams like Biodesign that are focusing on needs identification and understanding.
So what I realized that those solutions are really important. So I implement them, not knowing that those are not likely to be final solutions. Because one thing I realized is that when you create a solution, the interaction between the problem and the solution sheds light on the problem.
Gives you greater understanding.
Gives you more understanding of the problem. So I routinely do this, create solutions not with a view to saying, okay, now let's put it in production, but let's study the problem with that tool, the solution.
Yeah.
And so when I finalize it, you get this crystal clear understanding, but you've iterated half a dozen times, and each time the solution converges to its perfection.
So when you started MedRad, or when you're involved in the beginning of MedRad and then Ventritex, the world was very different then than it is today. Right? And I'm not saying it's more complex. There just does appear to be more stakeholders who have a role to play in our industry, whether it be the provider plays a bigger role now than the physician. The reimbursement, the payers are playing a big role. Regulatory agencies are playing a role. How do you put that is that part of understanding the problem?
Absolutely. Understanding so there are two questions, two sort of really critical questions you ask. One is, once you've identified a problem, you ask the question, is the problem worthy of commercialization, or does it have clinical efficacy, or if it's a non-medical thing, you ask that question, is it worthy of solving?
Yeah, the so what question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not every problem needs to be solved. And then the second question is the solution worth commercializing? Is the problem worth solving? Is the solution worth commercializing? Now, from each question emerges a whole set of criteria. So how do you select a problem? So I created a checklist of all the different criteria, and in that checklist you have regulatory, reimbursement, intellectual property, manufacturing, cost of goods, maybe in some cases physician training, if it's something very novel. And maybe a new surgical procedure is involved in it, whatever. So that checklist is important, and I start that checklist as I'm thinking about trying to understand the problem. This checklist is also circulating in my head, and and in some cases I go pretty far before I pull the plug. I go after big disruptive problems that haven't been solved before, and there's a business reason for that, and that is when you create a solution in an existing product category, maybe with an improvement and whatnot, you're likely to get some patents on that narrow improvement, but you're going to step on so many other people's patents. In addition, FDA is much more conservative. Let's say you want to invent a stent. Now there are a dozen or 24 stents approved, and the efficacy is very high. So how are you going to demonstrate that your stent is at least as good? You're going to have a clinical trial that's 10,000 patients.
Yeah, large sample size, yeah.
Right?
Yep.
But if you're doing the first stent that nobody had ever done, you could do that in a couple of hundred patients. So for me, the advantage going after disruptive things is that that means that condition is not being treated properly, and FDA is much more collaborative and wants that to be offered to the patients.
It's a little converse than what you'd think, right? Incremental is actually a little difficult. Well, I think it's more fulfilling, more meaningful, and that enables you to be able to bring on a stronger team and everything else that you get people.
Yeah, and think about it. If the way this innovation is defined, if you have identified a problem and framed it after study and analysis, a lot of the risk is off the table. And now you're playing in your own sandbox.
So you defined innovation, and involves a lot of disciplined thinking, right? But what you also said was the solutions inform you more of the problem.
I use
so this
it
is
as
not
a
sit and
this
think.
is such a powerful tool.
Yeah.
Such a powerful tool. And most engineers don't think that way. They'll come up with a solution. Their next step in their mind is, how do I manufacture it? How do I do this? And they forget. They never revisit the problem. Now they're married to the solution.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the mistake happens.
Yeah.
So you got to, I think you have to question everything. Everything you're doing should be looked at critically by you. And don't fall in love with these crazy ideas. You should be your own worst critic. And I usually, my strategy is to ask all the reasons why I shouldn't do it.
The basis for Rani, the current company. What was the inspiration?
Well, let me start off with saying that taking injectable biologic drugs and converting them to oral has been a dream of every pharmaceutical scientist. And for the last 50 years, there have been at least 150 attempts at converting insulin or parathyroid hormones, so small peptides, from injections to pills, and utterly failed, right? Because the bioavailability is really low. The enzymes just break down the proteins. And in the cases where it is successful, the bioavailability is like 0.1% or 0.5%. So this is where my medical school came in handy. So I remembered that intestines don't have pain sensors like your skin does. So I said, why not inject in the intestines? Are made out of muscle, smooth muscle cells, and they're highly vascularized. So can't we create a pill that goes through the stomach intact, goes in the intestine, transforms itself into an injection, and delivers a pain-free injection, then mostly disintegrates and is passed out. The remnants are passed out. So you create a single-use robot that does that. So I had severe heartburn after a very particularly spicy Indian meal, and around midnight I was having a glass of water with Alka-Seltzer, watching the bubbles come up, and I realized that was the energy source I was looking for. And I went in the next morning at like 6 a.m., got a piece of plastic, made a little balloon. Actually, I used a Ziploc bag, and I used my fingers to pinch it, and I put the two chemicals on each side and some water. And when I released it, it inflated, and self-inflating balloon. Yeah. I mean, that concept itself is a very valuable concept from a technology standpoint, because you can do so many things with it. But that became the energy. So the balloon also allowed me to align the microsyringe perpendicular to the intestinal wall, as well as providing the pressure needed to push the needle. And that was such an important invention, that technology. It was because the cost of goods is nothing. A piece of plastic, 1 or 2 pennies for the reactants, and molded parts for the microsyringe. So 30 cents, 25, 30 cents. You have it's ultimate in low cost, and you have this brainless robot that performs a single function, and performs it with very high fidelity. Clinical trials have shown 95% up to 95 to 100% success, and it's amazing. It's doing it autonomously, and it's an interplay between the physiology, the chemistry of the gut, the stomach, leveraging that and the polymer science of that's involved in the capsule and the chemistry.
How's the company doing now?
Excellent. We took it public last year.
Why do you think it's important to talk about your failures, or why do you love it?
Because embedded in that are so many gems. Why you failed is as important or more important than why you succeeded, and it tells you at least one way you shouldn't be doing it, it also sheds light on your own way of thinking, and it allows you to adjust that. So a couple of failures that were spectacular.
The best kind.
Yeah. In the early 90s, I created a company. So I back up. In the late 80s, the U.S. government declassified a material called nitinol. It used to be a classified material. Did you know that?
I did not know that.
So it was developed by the naval. So nitinol is called nickel titanium. NOL stands for Naval Ordnance Laboratory. So it was a classified material, secret, and they declassified it, and I got my hands on it. I really love that material. I do so many things, and experimenting with that, I created a wire, guide wire, and put that material electrically activated. So with a joystick, I could turn the tip in any direction. So I showed that to Jeff Hartzler, who's a brilliant interventionalist, and he was a techie. He loved technology, and I had the highest regard for him. He was an icon in interventional cardiology. So I went and showed it to him, and he said, "Let's start a company. This is cool." So I started. He wrote the first check, and several other people did. Before I knew it, the company had started. I had already filed some patents. We filed for did some animal studies, filed for a 510K, and then I went. He said, "Hey, I want you to show it to this friend of mine and this cardiologist." So I started showing it to other cardiologists, and they looked at it. They said, "It's beautiful. Well, why the hell did you do this? We don't need it. We can go into any part of the vascular anatomy with a floppy wire. We can shape it, and you can twist and turn." And I said, "Oh my God, what a..." So lesson learned that physicians are fallible, and sometimes they fall in love with technology just like engineers, and it colors their judgment. And so that went on the list. Don't trust the physicians, and question everybody. Just like you question yourself, you have to question every piece of advice you get.
Well, it goes back to the two pieces of advice you gave earlier in this discussion. So, yeah, totally get it. So we've got two questions to finish up. So where are you? Are you optimistic, pessimistic with the future of medtech?
Oh, I'm super optimistic. I think we've done all the easy stuff. Now, intelligently combining artificial intelligence where needed. Don't start with AI and say, "I'm going to solve this problem with AI." That's backwards. Start with the problem and see if it can benefit from AI applications, algorithms, and this combination of electronics, software, wireless technologies, all of these things can dramatically enhance a therapy. And so I keep focusing on therapies because I only like therapeutics. I don't much care for diagnostics.
I think the world is changing, right? I'd say here at Fogarty, go back 5 years, most of the devices or the tech that was coming in was therapeutic in nature.
Mm-hmm.
There is a huge, with the improvement in sensor technology, we're seeing it's probably 50-50 diagnostics. So it's I think we're seeing a trend.
But still, diagnostics are, see, the reason I think diagnostics are hard, because unless you're just doing the same thing, same test that's being done one way, doing it another way, that's not very interesting. But creating new tests, it only makes sense if those tests, because if those tests are going to be used to make therapeutic decisions, that takes a heck of a long time to have such a powerful test that you're going to make a therapeutic decision.
Yeah, it has to be actionable.
This better be bulletproof.
Yeah.
And to make a test bulletproof, a new test, takes years and lots of testing. So that's why I stay away from it.
All right, last one. If you're sitting here watching this today and you're in your 20s and you're starting off your career in medtech, what's a piece of advice you'd give somebody?
You're really lucky if you're doing it now. Then when I started, I didn't have role models, I didn't have mentors. It was a lonely journey and a scary journey. One of the scariest things in those days was I was so mortified in taking money from investors. And I figured that if I fail at this, I'll never be able to show my face to anyone. I mean, that was the only fear I had. But the power of that technology or the potential of that technology was such that we took the money. But today, there are hundreds of, literally thousands of experienced entrepreneurs who can guide you. And I would say everything you do is multidisciplinary.
Yep.
You might have expertise in one or two areas. Figure out what kind of expertise that problem requires or that solution requires, and surround yourself with those experts, whether it's a co-founder or whether it's a advisor or a set of advisors. One of the things that is beautiful about this multidisciplinary, you work with all these people, but it's also an opportunity for you to learn all these disciplines.
Yeah.
And to me, so you can develop expertise in a lot of different areas.
Yeah, I think I started off in regulatory and evolved into quality and into clinical and then into general management.
Yeah.
And it's an industry that allows you that opportunity.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's awesome. So that was great advice. Yeah. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today.
Such a pleasure.
Looking forward to talking more. Thank you for joining us on MedTech Trailblazers. We hope you enjoyed learning new things about another impact maker in our industry. Please do join me again for future episodes in our series by subscribing to this podcast. Please also like and share our content with your colleagues. We want to hear back from you with names of MedTech leaders you believe are trailblazers and whom we should also consider having on the show. Until next time, I'll leave you with my usual parting thoughts from Hannibal of Carthage that should resonate with all of us trying to make a difference for patients. And that is, I'll either find a way or make one. Cheers.